Lera's heart stopped as she pushed open the back door, her eyes scanning the yard for Misha. The day had been long, and she had hoped to find him curled up in his usual spot, waiting for her. But as she stepped into the dim light, something caught her eye, a dark shape lying motionless in the corner of the yard. Her breath caught in her throat as she rushed over, her footsteps faltering with each step. There, beneath the bush, was Misha, his small body twisted at an unnatural angle, his fur matted with blood. For a moment, she couldn't move, paralyzed by the horror of the sight. What had happened? Who would do this to him? The world seemed to tilt around her, the overwhelming fear that she might have lost him already sinking deep into her chest, making it hard to breathe. Chapter 1. The Alley Encounter. Lera walked home from school, her backpack heavy on her shoulders. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of her neighborhood. She loved this time of day, the soft golden light, the crisp evening air. But today, something felt different. A faint, desperate sound reached her ears. A weak, high-pitched meow. She stopped, listening closely. The sound came again, from somewhere nearby. Her heart quickened as she turned her head, trying to pinpoint the source. Then she saw it, a dark, narrow alley between two old buildings. The meowing was coming from there. Lera hesitated. She had always been told to stay away from alleys, especially when she was alone. But something inside her wouldn't let her walk away. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. As she moved closer, she saw them, a group of boys, older than her, maybe 14 or 15. They stood in a loose circle, laughing, their voices sharp in the cold air. And in the middle of them, trembling and small, was a tiny kitten. Lera's stomach twisted. One of the boys nudged the kitten with his foot, making it stumble and let out another pitiful cry. Another boy laughed and did the same. The kitten tried to run, but it was too weak, too scared. "Hey!" Lera's voice rang out before she even realized she had spoken. The boys turned to look at her, surprised. For a second, she wanted to run. Her heart pounded, and her hands were shaking. But then she saw the kitten, its tiny body shivering, its big eyes filled with fear. She couldn't leave. "What do you want?" one of the boys sneered. Lera swallowed hard. "Leave it alone." The boys exchanged amused glances. "Why do you care?" another one asked, kicking a small piece of trash on the ground. "Because it's not fair," Lera said, her voice steadier now. "It's just a kitten. It hasn't done anything to you." The tallest boy shrugged. "It's just a stray. No one cares about it." "I care," Lera said firmly. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one of the boys sighed. "Whatever," he muttered. "This is boring anyway." One by one, they walked away, their laughter fading as they disappeared down the street. Lera let out a shaky breath. She had done it. But now, she had another problem. The kitten. It was curled up against the cold pavement, its tiny body rising and falling with quick, frightened breaths. Lera crouched down carefully. "Hey there," she whispered, reaching out her hand slowly. "It's okay now. They're gone." The kitten didn't move. Up close, she could see that its fur was dirty and matted. There was a small cut on its ear, and its paw looked swollen. She needed to take it home. Lera carefully reached for the kitten, but the moment her fingers touched its fur, it lashed out with tiny claws, scratching her wrist. She winced but didn't pull away. "I know you're scared," she said gently. "But I won't hurt you." The kitten let out a weak hiss and tried to stand, but its injured paw gave out, and it collapsed again. Lera took off her scarf and carefully wrapped it around the tiny creature, creating a soft cocoon. This time, when she lifted it, the kitten didn't fight as much. It was too weak. She held it close to her chest, feeling its fast, unsteady heartbeat against her hands. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. But as she walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The first day at home. Lera pushed open the door to her room and stepped inside, carefully cradling the tiny bundle wrapped in her scarf. The kitten barely moved, its small body tense against her hands. As soon as she placed it on the floor and unwrapped the scarf, the little creature sprang to life. With a weak but determined hiss, the kitten darted away, disappearing under her bed. Lera knelt down and peered into the darkness. Two wide, frightened eyes stared back at her. "It's okay," she whispered. "I won't hurt you." The kitten didn't move. It just sat there, pressed against the wall, shivering. Lera sighed and sat back on her heels. She had hoped it would understand that she was trying to help. But of course, after everything it had been through, trust wouldn't come so easily. She stood up and quietly walked to her closet, pulling out an old, soft towel. Then she grabbed a small cardboard box from under her desk and lined it with the towel, making a makeshift bed. "Here," she said softly, placing it near the bed. "In case you want somewhere warm to sleep." She stepped back, giving the kitten space, but it didn't move. It just stayed there, small and scared. Lera sighed. "We'll figure it out," she murmured, more to herself than to the kitten. Parents' objections. Just as she was about to sit on her bed, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. A second later, her door swung open. "Lera, dinner." Her mother stopped mid-sentence, eyes immediately locking onto the tiny figure under the bed. "Lera, what is that?" Lera bit her lip. "It's a kitten," she said carefully. "I can see that," her mother said, stepping inside. "Where did it come from?" "I found it," Lera admitted. "It was being hurt by some boys in an alley. I couldn't just leave it." Her mother's expression softened slightly, but then she sighed. "Lera, you know we can't keep a stray animal. It could be sick. We should take it to a shelter." "No." Lera's voice was sharper than she intended. She took a deep breath and tried again. "I mean, please. Just for a few days. It's so scared. It won't survive in a shelter." Her father appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "A few days, huh?" he said, raising an eyebrow. Lera nodded quickly. "I'll take care of it. I promise. I'll feed it, clean up after it, everything. Just, please." Her parents exchanged glances. Finally, her mother sighed. "All right. But only a few days, Lera. And if it seems sick, we take it to a vet." A relieved smile spread across Lera's face. "Thank you. I promise, I'll do everything." Her father shook his head, muttering something about soft hearts, but he didn't argue. A place to rest. After dinner, Lera returned to her room with a small bowl of warm milk and some leftover chicken her mother had let her take. She placed them near the bed, hoping the kitten would be tempted. She sat on the floor a few feet away, watching. The kitten remained under the bed, unmoving. Lera rested her chin on her knees, trying to be patient. "You don't have to come out right now," she said softly. "Just know that you're safe." Minutes passed. The house grew quieter as her parents settled into their evening routine. Lera kept her eyes on the tiny creature under her bed, willing it to trust her. Nothing. Finally, she sighed and climbed into bed. Maybe it just needed more time. She turned off the light and pulled the blanket up to her chin, listening to the soft hum of the night outside her window. The room was silent. Until a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A tiny, weak meow. Lera held her breath. Was the kitten finally starting to trust her? Chapter 3. Small steps toward trust. Lera woke up to the dim light of early morning filtering through her curtains. She stretched, her mind still foggy with sleep, when she felt it. Something small and warm curled up at her feet. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her blanket just enough to peek underneath. There, nestled against the fabric, was the tiny kitten. Its little body rose and fell with soft, steady breaths. Lera didn't move. She barely even breathed. Was this trust? Or had the kitten simply been seeking warmth in the middle of the night? She didn't know, but she wasn't going to ruin the moment. She let the blanket fall back into place and lay still, afraid that even the slightest movement would startle the kitten away. But as the minutes passed, her mind drifted back to the night before. The way the kitten had finally come out to eat, the way it had quickly darted back under the bed afterward. This was progress. Slow, fragile progress, but progress nonetheless. And now it was here. She smiled to herself and closed her eyes again, not quite ready to get up. The first attempt. Later that morning, the kitten was gone again, tucked safely back under the bed. Lera sat on the floor beside it, watching the tiny figure pressed against the wall. She had read online that building trust with a frightened animal required patience. No sudden movements, no loud noises, no forcing it to interact before it was ready. Still, she wanted to try. Carefully, she reached out her hand, palm facing up. She didn't move closer, just held it there, a few inches away. The kitten's ears flicked. Its wide eyes locked onto her fingers. For a second, Lera thought it might sniff her hand, maybe even take a tiny step forward. Then, a sharp hiss. Lera flinched but didn't pull back immediately. The kitten's small body was rigid, its fur slightly puffed. She sighed and slowly withdrew her hand. "Okay," she murmured. "Not yet." She didn't feel discouraged. The internet articles had warned her that this would take time, and the kitten was still scared. It had every reason to be. She stood up and walked over to her desk, leaving the kitten alone. Maybe if she gave it space, it would start to trust her on its own. A watchful eye. That evening, Lera came into her room with a small plate of shredded chicken and another bowl of warm milk. She placed them near the bed but didn't sit beside them this time. Instead, she turned off the light, climbed onto her bed, and waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of the television in the living room. Lera stayed still, fighting the urge to peek under the bed. And then, finally, a soft rustling. She held her breath. In the darkness, she heard tiny paws against the floor. A faint sound of lapping milk. A small crunch of chicken between tiny teeth. She wanted to smile, but she forced herself to stay silent. A few minutes later, she heard the soft padding of paws retreating, then silence. She exhaled slowly. The kitten had eaten. It wasn't much, but it was something. Research and patience. The next day, Lera spent hours reading about taming stray kittens. They needed consistency. A calm environment. Soft voices. Slow movements. Food given at regular times to establish trust. She took notes. Maybe she was overthinking it, but she wanted to do this right. After school, she stopped by a pet store and used some of her saved-up allowance to buy a small toy mouse and a packet of soft treats. She had read that play was one of the best ways to build trust. When she got home, she carefully placed the toy near the kitten's hiding spot. She didn't expect it to play right away, but maybe eventually, it would be curious enough to try. And then, she waited. A sign of trust. That night, Lera repeated her routine. Food, silence, patience. She lay in bed, listening, waiting. Once again, the kitten emerged, eating quickly before slipping back under the bed. But this time, something was different. Lera didn't move, pretending to be asleep. But after several minutes, she felt a soft pressure near her feet. A tiny shift in weight. A hesitant warmth. Her heart pounded. The kitten had crawled onto her bed again. Lera didn't dare open her eyes. She just lay there, feeling the small, fragile body settle in beside her feet. Was this trust? Or was the kitten just looking for warmth? She didn't know. But she would find out soon. Chapter 4. First difficulties. Lera sat cross-legged on her bed, watching the kitten sleep. It had curled up in a tight little ball near her pillow, its tiny body rising and falling with each slow breath. For the first time, it looked almost peaceful. But now that she could see it clearly in the daylight, something made her stomach twist. There were small wounds on its body, faint bruises under the fur, a crusted-over scratch on its ear, and when it shifted, she noticed it was keeping weight off one of its back legs. Lera bit her lip. How had she not noticed before? She had been so focused on getting the kitten to trust her that she hadn't even thought about whether it was hurt. She needed to do something. Fear of the vet. At breakfast, she brought it up carefully. "I think the kitten's hurt," she said, stirring her oatmeal without really eating it. "It has some scratches and bruises. Maybe a hurt leg." Her mother sighed. "Then we should take it to a vet." Lera hesitated. "What if they say we have to leave it at a shelter?" Her father looked up from his newspaper. "Lera, if the kitten is sick or badly hurt, you can't just take care of it on your own. A vet will know what's best." Lera's stomach twisted. "But what if?" Her mother held up a hand. "How about this? You take it for a checkup, and if it's something we can treat at home, we'll try. But this is your responsibility." Lera nodded quickly. "Okay. I'll take care of everything." She was relieved, but her chest still felt tight. She knew some shelters didn't try very hard to find homes for stray animals. And she couldn't let that happen. The vet visit. A few hours later, Lera sat in the waiting room of a small veterinary clinic, the kitten bundled in a towel in her lap. It had been tense the entire walk there, pressing its tiny body against her chest as if expecting something bad to happen. Now, in the bright, sterile-smelling clinic, it was even more terrified. It trembled under the towel, ears flat, tiny claws gripping the fabric. Lera stroked its head gently. "It's okay," she murmured. "No one's going to hurt you." When the vet, a kind-looking woman with warm brown eyes, finally called them in, Lera felt her heart race. She explained everything: how she had found the kitten, how it had been kicked by the boys, and how it barely let her touch it. The vet nodded and gently took the kitten from her hands. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Lera held her breath as the examination began. The kitten hissed weakly at first, but the vet was patient. She spoke softly, working quickly as she ran her hands along its tiny body. After a few minutes, she stepped back. "It's bruised, but nothing's broken. The cut on its ear will heal on its own, but the leg needs some treatment. I'll prescribe an antibiotic ointment and something for the pain. You'll need to apply it every day." Lera exhaled in relief. "So, I can take it home?" The vet smiled. "Of course. But it won't be easy. He's scared, and he might not let you help him at first. Just be patient." Lera nodded, determination settling in her chest. She had gotten this far. She wasn't going to give up now. A struggle at home. Back in her room, Lera unwrapped the kitten and set it down carefully. It immediately bolted under the bed. She sighed. "I know you don't trust me yet, but you have to let me help you." She opened the small bag from the clinic, pulling out the ointment and a cotton pad. Crouching down, she reached under the bed, moving slowly. "Come on, little guy. It's just some medicine." The kitten's eyes widened. Then, a sharp hiss. Before she could react, it scrambled out from under the bed and darted across the room. Lera lunged forward and managed to scoop it up, holding it firmly but gently. It squirmed wildly in her grip, tiny claws digging into her arm. She winced but didn't let go. "It's okay," she murmured. "Just a little bit, and then I'll let you go." She dipped the cotton pad into the ointment and carefully pressed it to the wound on its leg. The kitten let out a sharp, pitiful cry and twisted in her hands. Then, it bit her. Not hard, just a quick nip. But it startled her enough that she loosened her grip. The kitten leaped out of her hands and shot back under the bed. Lera sat on the floor, breathing hard, her wrist stinging where its teeth had grazed her skin. She looked at the ointment in her hand. How was she going to do this every day? She swallowed, staring at the dark space under her bed. Would she be able to earn its trust enough to help it? Or was she already failing? Chapter 5. Care and Patience. Lera sat on the floor beside her bed, holding a tiny piece of boiled chicken between her fingers. The kitten watched her warily from under the bed, its ears slightly flattened. It had been hiding there since their last struggle, its injured leg tucked beneath its body. Lera sighed. "I know you don't like me right now," she murmured. "But I promise, I'm trying to help." She placed the piece of chicken on the floor a few inches away and slowly backed away, watching carefully. For a long moment, the kitten didn't move. Then, hesitantly, it stretched its nose forward, sniffing the air. Lera held her breath as it took a single cautious step. Then another. And finally, it snatched the chicken and retreated back under the bed, chewing quickly. Lera let out a quiet laugh. "See? That wasn't so bad. It wasn't much, but it was something." And she was going to build on that. A struggle, but less resistance. That evening, Lera prepared herself for another attempt. She had a plan: distract the kitten with food while she gently cleaned its wounds. With a small plate of shredded chicken beside her, she reached under the bed again. The kitten's eyes flashed with suspicion, but this time, it didn't immediately run. She placed a tiny piece of meat near its paws and waited. The kitten hesitated, then quickly ate it. Taking a deep breath, Lera dipped a cotton pad in the antiseptic solution and reached for the injured leg. As soon as she touched it, the kitten let out a sharp hiss and swatted at her hand. Lera pulled back just in time, but she didn't retreat completely. Instead, she picked up another piece of chicken and offered it again. The kitten eyed her, as if debating whether the food was worth the trouble. After a long pause, it took the chicken from her fingers. She tried again. This time, when she gently dabbed at the wound, the kitten still struggled, but not as violently. Its little claws swiped at her, but without full force. She whispered softly, "It's okay. Just a little more." The kitten's tail twitched, but it didn't bite her. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking, but she had done it. And the kitten had let her. Learning patience. Over the next few days, Lera followed the same routine. She always had food ready before she tried to clean the kitten's wounds. She moved slowly, speaking softly. And little by little, the kitten stopped fighting her so fiercely. It still didn't trust her completely, but the wild panic in its eyes had softened. Lera was learning, too. She had never realized how much patience it would take to care for something so small and afraid. But the more time she spent with the kitten, the more she understood. It wasn't just about food or medicine. It was about trust. And trust wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. A breakthrough. One evening, as she finished treating the kitten's leg, something happened that made Lera freeze. She had just put away the ointment and was carefully stroking its fur, speaking to it in a quiet voice. And then, a sound. Soft, low, and unfamiliar. Lera's eyes widened. The kitten was purring. It was faint, barely more than a vibration against her fingers, but it was there. Her heart swelled. She had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it. The kitten leaned ever so slightly into her touch. Lera smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. Maybe, just maybe, it was starting to trust her. But would it ever trust her completely? Chapter 6. First joys and a new fear. For the first time since Lera had brought the kitten home, she woke up to find it sitting beside her pillow. She blinked in surprise, still groggy from sleep. The tiny creature looked at her with cautious eyes, its tail curled neatly around its paws. Then, slowly, hesitantly, it pressed its small head against her hand. Lera froze, barely daring to breathe. Did this mean? She carefully lifted her fingers and stroked its soft fur. The kitten let out a quiet purr. Lera felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat. It trusted her. Not completely. Not yet. But this was something real. Something special. A playful change. Over the next few days, the kitten's behavior changed. It no longer hid under the bed all day. Instead, it followed Lera around the room, watching her with curious eyes. One afternoon, as she was doing her homework, she noticed the kitten pawing at a small rubber ball that had rolled under her desk. Lera smiled. "You like that?" She reached down, picked up the bowl, and rolled it gently across the floor. The kitten's ears perked up. It watched the ball for a moment, then pounced. Lera laughed, covering her mouth so she wouldn't startle it. She rolled the ball again, and the kitten chased after it, its tiny paws skidding against the wooden floor. For the first time, it wasn't just surviving. It was playing. And that made Lera's heart swell with happiness. An empty room. But that happiness didn't last. One afternoon, Lera came home from school, eager to see the kitten. She dropped her backpack by the door, kicked off her shoes, and hurried to her room. "Hey, little guy," she called. Silence. Her smile faded. Usually by now, the kitten would peek out from under the bed or sit on the windowsill, watching her. But the room was empty. Her heart began to pound. Maybe he was just sleeping? She crouched down and lifted the blanket, peering under the bed. Nothing. She checked behind her desk, behind the wardrobe, inside the closet. Still nothing. Panic started to creep in. Where was he? A desperate search. Lera tore through the apartment, checking every possible hiding place. The couch. Empty. The bathroom. Nowhere to be found. The kitchen. No sign of him. By the time she checked the hallway for the third time, her hands were shaking. She forced herself to take a deep breath. He had to be here somewhere. Unless... Her eyes darted toward the slightly open balcony door. No. Lera ran to the balcony, her heart hammering. It wasn't a big drop, just the second floor, but if he had fallen... She leaned over the railing, scanning the area below. And then... A faint, familiar sound reached her ears. A soft, frightened meow. Lera's breath caught. She turned toward the stairwell, her legs moving before her mind could even catch up. The kitten was out there. But where? And was he okay? Chapter 7. The Secret Guest. Lera raced down the stairs, her breath coming in short gasps. The meowing had stopped, but she knew what she had heard. Pushing open the heavy basement door, she hesitated at the top of the short staircase leading into the dimly lit space below. The air smelled of dust and damp concrete. "Kitty," she called softly, stepping inside. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the shadows. Her heart leaped with relief. There, crouched near an old stack of wooden crates, was her kitten. But he didn't run to her. Instead, he stayed where he was, his tail curled around his paws. Lera frowned. "Come here, little guy. Let's go home." The kitten didn't move. And then, a soft rustling sound came from the darkness behind him. Lera squinted into the shadows. Something was there. And then, another tiny figure hesitantly stepped into the faint light. Lera gasped. It was another kitten. Even smaller than hers, with the same wide, frightened eyes. A little brother. Lera's breath caught in her throat as she watched the two kittens. Her kitten turned toward the smaller one and let out a gentle, reassuring meow. And the tiny creature, so frail and thin that Lera's heart ached, pressed its little body against him, as if seeking protection. Realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't just another stray kitten. This was his sibling. His little brother. Lera swallowed hard. Her kitten had snuck out, not to run away, but to check on his brother. To take care of him. She knelt down slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been looking after him, haven't you?" The kitten flicked his tail, watching her cautiously. Lera's chest tightened. How long had they been alone out here? How many nights had they huddled together, hungry and cold? She had thought she was rescuing just one. But now she knew. There were two lives that needed saving. A careful approach. Lera placed the small bag she had brought on the ground and carefully unzipped it. Inside, she had packed some soft food, hoping to coax her kitten out. Now, she had two mouths to feed. She pulled out a small piece and placed it in front of them. Her kitten immediately sniffed at it, but his brother stayed back, his tiny body trembling. Lera didn't move. She simply waited. A few moments later, The small kitten took a hesitant step forward. Then another. And finally, he nibbled at the food. Lera smiled softly. "That's it, little guy. It's okay." But as soon as she reached out her hand, the tiny kitten let out a sharp hiss and darted back into the shadows. Lera bit her lip. This wasn't going to be easy. A new dilemma. Her kitten rubbed against her leg, as if sensing her worry. Lera gently stroked his fur, her mind racing. She had to get them both home. But how? Her kitten trusted her now, but his little brother didn't. If she grabbed him too fast, she could scare him even more. If she left, there was no guarantee she'd find them again. And if she didn't do something soon, they'd both be stuck here in the cold. She took a slow, deep breath. She had saved one kitten before. She would do it again. Even if it took all the patience she had. But would the tiny kitten ever trust her enough to come home? Chapter 8. Two Small Hearts. Lera walked carefully, cradling both kittens in her arms. One curled up in her hands and the other nestled against her chest. Her heart was full, a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. She had done it. She had managed to get both of them home. The hallway of their small apartment seemed even more cramped as she passed through it, balancing the two small, trembling creatures. She opened the door to her room and gently set them down on the soft rug by the window. Her kitten, the one she had been caring for days, immediately padded over to the little bed she had made for him, and curled up in it, purring softly. But the smaller one, the frightened one, barely stirred. Instead, he backed away, his wide eyes darting from corner to corner of the room. He didn't move much, just stood frozen in place, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. Lera crouched down slowly, making herself as small as possible so she wouldn't scare him. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered. "You're safe here too. I'm not going to hurt you." But the little kitten wasn't so sure. He looked at her for a moment, then darted across the room, hiding behind her desk, just out of reach. Lera sighed, sitting back on her heels. It was going to take time. Double the responsibility. Lera's heart felt heavy as she watched the kitten retreat into the shadows. Her initial excitement had faded, replaced by the sobering realization that bringing both kittens home had meant taking on twice the responsibility. She had already been learning how to care for one kitten, but now she had two small lives depending on her. How was she supposed to balance it all? She had already spent so many hours reading about caring for stray kittens, but this was different. This wasn't just about feeding and cleaning. It was about building trust. It was about helping them learn to trust people again after all they had been through. The younger kitten was afraid of her, terrified, even. And the older one, though he had warmed to her, was still wary at times. Lera stood up slowly and looked around her room. She knew she would need to be patient. She could feel her chest tighten with the weight of it all. But as she glanced at the kittens again, she realized something. She couldn't back down now. She had already committed to caring for them. And she was going to see it through, no matter how hard it got. Parents' concerns. Lera's parents came home from work later that evening. At first, they didn't say anything as they walked into the apartment. They must have seen the small bundles of fur resting in the corner of her room. But neither of them made a comment. But Lera knew the questions were coming. "Lera," her mom began, her voice cautious. "What is all this?" Lera stood up from where she had been sitting on the floor with the kittens. Her heart pounded in her chest. They're the kittens I found," she explained, her voice small. "I couldn't just leave them there, Mom. They were hungry and scared. Please, I've been taking care of them." Her dad crossed his arms, frowning. "We talked about this. You can't just bring home every stray animal you find." Lera bit her lip, fighting back tears. She had expected this. I know it's a lot. But please, they need me. They need someone to take care of them." Her mom and dad exchanged a glance. They didn't say anything for a long moment. Lera's heart sank. Finally, her mom spoke, her tone softer. "We can't just let them roam free in here. You'll need to be responsible for them. And I'm not sure you fully realize how much work this will be, Lera. Lera nodded, a wave of determination flooding through her. I know, but I'll do it. I'll feed them, clean them, and make sure they're safe. I promise. Her dad let out a long sigh. All right. But if you're going to keep them, we're going to need to work together. No more surprises. Lera. This is serious. Her mom added, we'll help, but you need to show us you're ready to take on the responsibility. Lera's heart lifted slightly at her parents' words. They weren't thrilled, but they were willing to help. That was all she needed. Research and patience. That night, after dinner, Lera sat at her desk, her textbooks pushed aside as she pulled out her phone. She had to learn more. There was still so much she didn't know about kittens, about how to help them adjust to a new life, how to teach them to trust humans again. She searched for information about socializing feral kittens, knowing it was going to be difficult, especially for the younger one who was so skittish. The first few pages she read made her feel overwhelmed. The process was long. It would take time and effort. But she knew there was no turning back now. She took notes, jotting down techniques for gaining a kitten's trust, creating a safe space, and slowly introducing them to human touch. She had already begun doing some of those things, but now she had a better idea of how to proceed. The older kitten was adjusting well, but the younger one, she couldn't let him stay frightened forever. She glanced over at the two kittens. The older one was napping peacefully by the window, but the younger one was still hidden in the corner, his small body tense. But every once in a while, he would look toward his brother, his eyes softening just a little. Lera smiled. If she was patient and gentle, maybe, just maybe, he'd learn to trust her too. A tiny step forward. Days passed, and Lera continued her routine with the kittens. She fed them on time, changed their bedding, and did her best to interact with them in ways that wouldn't overwhelm them. She spent extra time with the younger kitten, talking softly to him, sitting on the floor near him, not forcing anything, just letting him observe her. And one afternoon, while she sat on the floor reading, something happened. The younger kitten, tentative and hesitant, slipped from his hiding spot. He crept closer to her, his body low to the ground. Lera held her breath, not wanting to startle him. The kitten sat down a few feet away, watching her with wide eyes. Then, slowly, carefully, he began to approach her again. Lera's heart skipped a beat as he drew nearer, closer to her hand. He sniffed it briefly, then paused, unsure. And for the first time, Lera could feel him relax just a little bit. He wasn't fully there yet. But it was a start. And for Lera, that was everything. But the question still lingered in her mind. Would the younger kitten ever fully trust her? Would he ever come to see her as more than a stranger? Or would it take even more time, more patience, and more love than she could imagine? Chapter 9. A new home or a new family. The kittens were no longer the frightened, weak creatures they had been when Lera had first found them. Their fur was soft, their eyes bright, and their playful antics filled her room with joy. Both of them had healed, and they were now the little companions she had always dreamed of. But there was still one looming issue: her parents. "Sweetheart," her mom began one evening, sitting down next to Lera on the couch. "We've talked about this, and we think it's time to start looking for a new home for the kittens." Lera's heart sank. She knew this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. "What do you mean, a new home?" Lera asked, her voice trembling slightly. Her dad, who was standing in the doorway, spoke up. "They're doing well now. We can't keep them forever, Lera. We already agreed this was temporary." Lera felt a lump in her throat. She had come to love the kittens so much, and the idea of sending them away to a new home, one where she couldn't protect them, made her stomach churn. "Please, don't send them away," Lera whispered, looking down at the kittens as they played on the rug. "I don't want them to end up back on the street. Or worse, in the hands of someone who doesn't care for them." Her parents exchanged a glance. "We know you've grown attached to them," her mom said softly. "But you need to understand that they're not going to be here forever. It's time to start thinking about their future. Lera nodded, though her mind was racing. What if they ended up in a bad home? What if they were mistreated or abandoned again? She couldn't let that happen. Not to them. A plan for a safe future. Lera lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Her parents had been clear. The kittens couldn't stay forever. But she couldn't just give them to anyone. She had to find them a home where they would be loved and cared for, a home where they could be safe. The more she thought about it, the more determined she became. She wasn't going to let her kittens be sent to some random person who might not appreciate them. She would find the right place. She had to. The next morning, Lera went outside to talk to Mr. Ivanov, their neighbor. He was an older man who lived alone and had always been kind to Lera. He liked animals, but never had any of his own. Lera felt a little nervous as she approached his front door, but she knew this was her best option. "Mr. Ivanov?" she asked, standing at his doorstep. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course, Lera. Come on in." He opened the door wide, smiling warmly. Lera hesitated, then blurted, "I was wondering if you would consider taking one of the kittens. The smaller one." Mr. Ivanov raised an eyebrow, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "Taking in a kitten, you say? Well, I don't know. I've never had one of my own. They're both healthy now," Lera explained quickly. "And I think he would love to have a new home with you. I know you're good with animals, and he'd have a lot of space to roam around here." Mr. Ivanov looked at her, clearly considering the idea. "You really think he'll be happy here?" Lera nodded eagerly. "I do. And you'd make sure he's safe. You'd take care of him, right?" Mr. Ivanov smiled gently. "I suppose it could work. All right, I'll take him. It seems like a good idea." Lera's heart swelled with relief. She had found a good home for the younger kitten. He would be safe with Mr. Ivanov, who would treat him well. But there was still the matter of the older kitten. The older kitten's attachment. That night, as Lera lay in bed, she felt the familiar weight of the older kitten curling up next to her under the covers. He had been doing this for weeks now, but tonight it felt different. There was a sense of finality to it. The little kitten, who wasn't so little anymore, snuggled close, pressing himself against her side as he always did. His purrs were soft, almost like a whisper in the quiet of the night. But Lera felt a knot tighten in her chest. Tomorrow, the younger kitten would be leaving. "I'll still visit, I promise," she whispered to him, her voice barely audible. She had no idea if the kitten understood her words, but she hoped the gentle tone would reassure him. He had become so attached to her, and she had become so attached to him. Would it be too hard to let go of both of them? The thought of saying goodbye to the older kitten, the one who had been with her since the very beginning, made her heart ache. He had been with her through every moment, through the struggle, the doubts, and the joy. He had trusted her when no one else had, and now she was supposed to send him away? As if sensing her uncertainty, the kitten nuzzled her hand, his purring louder now. He had come to rely on her, just as much as she had relied on him. "Don't worry," she whispered again, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to comfort more, him or herself. "You'll be fine. You'll both be fine." But the question lingered. Could she really let him go? Could she watch him walk out of her life, even if it meant he would have a better future? The final decision. The next morning, Lera sat on the couch, the kittens curled up beside her. Mr. Ivanov was due to arrive soon to pick up the younger one, and Lera felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. The time had come. Her mom and dad were in the kitchen, quietly preparing for the inevitable. Her dad was already talking about the arrangements, his voice matter of fact. It was as if this was the only logical thing to do. But Lera couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The older kitten, the one she had grown so close to, hadn't left her side all morning. He followed her from room to room, his bright eyes always watching her with a sense of quiet trust. Lera leaned down and stroked his fur, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't want to say goodbye," she whispered. "But I have to. You'll be safe. I promise." The doorbell rang. Lera wiped her eyes quickly and stood up. Mr. Ivanov had arrived. But as she walked toward the door, the older kitten mewed softly, his small paws pressing against her legs as if asking her to stay. "Goodbye, little one," Lera said quietly, her heart breaking. The kittens had to go. They had to find their place in the world. But she couldn't help but wonder, would they ever forget her? Would they always remember the girl who had cared for them when no one else would? The thought filled her with a deep sense of longing. She didn't know the answers yet, but one thing was clear. No matter where they went, they would always have a piece of her heart. Chapter 10. A Kind Heart. Lera stood at Mr. Ivanov's door, holding the younger kitten in her arms. The older one, who had become so deeply entwined with her life, was sitting at her feet, his soft fur brushing against her legs. It was time for the little one to start his new life with Mr. Ivanov. But as Lera handed him over, a pang of sadness gripped her chest. "Take good care of him," Lera whispered, her voice almost breaking as she looked at Mr. Ivanov. The older kitten, who had been so attached to her, meowed softly at the door. His eyes fixed on her with a sense of silent understanding. He knew what was happening, even if he didn't fully grasp the reason. Mr. Ivanov smiled kindly and nodded. "I will, Lera. He'll be safe here. And thank you for everything." With one last gentle pat on the younger kitten's head, Lera slowly backed away from the door. The sadness in her heart was overwhelming, but she kept telling herself it was the right thing to do. The little one was going to a good home, and that was all that mattered. She turned to leave, and as she did, the older kitten followed her. He had been quiet all the while, but now, his small voice broke the silence. He meowed softly, as if reassuring her that he would always be there. A deep connection. Lera walked slowly back to her house, the older kitten padding along behind her. She couldn't shake the feeling of loss as she passed the familiar streets, the weight of the day bearing down on her. The younger kitten was gone, and though she knew it was the best for him, it still hurt. When she stepped inside, her parents greeted her with smiles, but their expressions softened as they saw the sadness in her eyes. "Lera, it'll be okay," her mother said gently. "He'll be happy with Mr. Ivanov." "I know," Lera replied, trying to keep her composure, "but I already miss him. I don't know if I'm ready for him to leave." Her mom gave her a thoughtful look, then turned to her dad. "Maybe we should consider keeping the other one," she said quietly. Lera looked up, wide-eyed. "You mean him?" Her dad nodded. "You've shown so much care for both of them. We can see how much effort you've put into taking care of him, and he's become a part of our family too. Maybe it's time we let him stay." Lera's heart soared. She couldn't believe it. Her parents, who had once insisted the kittens couldn't stay, were finally giving their approval. The bond she had built with the older kitten was strong, and now, it seemed that bond would only grow deeper. Unbreakable trust. As the days passed, the older kitten, whom Lera had begun calling Misha, settled into the rhythm of their home. He was no longer the frightened, wild creature he had been when she first found him. Misha had learned to trust her completely. He slept curled up next to her every night, and during the day, he would sit on her lap, purring contentedly as she read or did homework. His once hesitant movements had now become confident, his fur soft and clean, his eyes filled with trust. He no longer flinched when she reached out to pet him, and every time she spoke to him, he would nuzzle her hand, his purrs louder and more constant. It was as if he knew, deep down, that he was safe with her. Lera smiled as Misha climbed onto her lap one afternoon, his tiny paws kneading her legs as he settled in for a nap. She gently stroked his back, marveling at how far they had come together. He was no longer afraid of people, and he was no longer a stray. He had found his place in her life, just as she had found hers in his. The change within. One evening, as Lera sat in the living room, Misha jumped up onto the couch beside her and curled up on the cushion. He looked up at her with those deep, trusting eyes, and for a moment, Lera felt a profound sense of peace. It was as if everything had come full circle. She had saved him, but in doing so, he had saved her too. She thought back to the first time she had found him, weak, frightened, and alone. She had been scared too, not knowing if she could help him, not knowing if he would survive. But now they were a family. She had learned so much about responsibility, about patience, and about the importance of caring for those who couldn't care for themselves. And Misha had learned to trust. He had learned that not all humans were cruel or indifferent. He had learned that love and kindness were real. "Thank you for trusting me," Lera whispered, stroking his fur gently. Misha looked up at her, his small eyes shining, and nuzzled her hand in response. His purring filled the room, a soft, comforting sound that seemed to echo the bond they had formed over the past few weeks. Lera realized then that it wasn't just her who had changed, it was them both. They had learned from each other, and through their journey, they had become something more than just a girl and a kitten. They had become a family. A heart transformed. As the weeks turned into months, Lera continued to care for Misha, watching him grow stronger, more confident, and even more affectionate. He would greet her at the door every time she came home, his tail flicking happily as he rubbed against her legs. He was no longer the wild, frightened kitten who had stumbled into her life one rainy evening. He had become a loving companion, always by her side, always reminding her of the power of kindness. Lera had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come when you least expect them. By opening her heart to a small, frightened creature, she had found not only a friend but also a deeper understanding of herself. She had learned that love and compassion could heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes, saving a life wasn't just about helping another, it was about helping yourself. And as she looked at Misha, curled up on her lap, purring contentedly, Lera knew that she had made the right choice. She had given him a chance, and in return, he had given her a piece of his heart. Their story, one of trust, compassion, and healing, was just beginning.